There comes a point where you've done everything. You've read the books, you've sat through therapy, you've set the boundaries, confronted the shadow, grieved the losses, tried the practices. You've fought, healed, processed, released, rebuilt. And still something hasn't resolved. Still something sits at the center of your chest like a stone that won't dissolve no matter how many techniques you throw at it. You've reached a place where effort itself has become the obstacle, but nobody told you that was possible. Nobody told you there was a stage beyond doing the work, where the work is to stop working entirely. Carl Jung documented this stage late in his career, and what he found shook his entire therapeutic framework. He'd spent decades developing methods for confronting the unconscious, integrating the shadow, dismantling false personas. His life's work was built on the idea that consciousness expands through effort, through active engagement with the psyche. But then he encountered patients who had done all of that and still hadn't arrived at wholeness. They'd done the work honestly, courageously, thoroughly, and they were stuck. Not because they hadn't worked hard enough, because they had reached a threshold where working harder was the very thing keeping them from what they needed most. Jung called what lay beyond that threshold the Sophia stage. Named after the ancient archetype of divine wisdom, this wasn't a phase you could achieve through effort or strategy. It was the psychological moment when the ego finally exhausts its entire repertoire, and something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath all the striving, rises to take its place. Jung described it as the point where the self stops asking the ego for permission and begins to move on its own. But getting there required something the ego was designed never to do: complete surrender. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about the Sophia stage, why reaching it means you've already done everything that effort can accomplish, what actually happens in the psyche when there's nothing left to do but let go, and why this stage that feels like the end of your path is actually the beginning of the only transformation that was ever going to make you whole. To understand the Sophia stage, you need to understand what Jung observed about the limits of psychological work. He watched patients progress beautifully through shadow integration. They'd confront their darkness, acknowledge their wounds, take responsibility for patterns they'd been running unconsciously. They'd become more honest, more boundaried, more aware. By any therapeutic measure, they were healthier, and yet many of them reported a persistent emptiness that none of this work addressed. A quiet, stubborn knowing that something essential was still missing, despite all the progress they had made. Jung initially assumed this meant they hadn't gone deep enough, that there were more layers of shadow to integrate, more unconscious material to surface. So he'd push them further into the work, and they'd comply, because these were committed people who believed in the process. They'd dig deeper, process more, confront harder. But the emptiness didn't budge. If anything, it intensified. The more they worked, the more the unnamed thing at their center refused to yield to effort. This baffled Jung until he recognized a pattern he'd been missing. Every patient who reached this impasse shared something in common. They had all arrived at a place where they knew themselves deeply, but didn't trust what was beyond themselves. They'd mastered the psychological landscape of their own psyche. They understood their wounds, their defenses, their patterns, their shadow. They'd mapped the interior territory with impressive thoroughness, but all of that mapping was still ego activity, the ego studying the ego, the conscious mind examining the unconscious. And there was a realm of the psyche that this approach could never reach because it existed beyond the ego's capacity to analyze or control. Jung called this realm the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche that includes but vastly exceeds conscious awareness. And he recognized that the Sophia stage was what happened when someone had developed their ego to its highest capacity and now needed to surrender that capacity to something larger, not abandon it, not destroy it, but release the grip of control that the ego maintained even during the most honest psychological work. This is what makes the Sophia stage so disorienting for people who have done serious inner work. You've built your healing on the principle that awareness leads to change. That understanding patterns breaks them. That confronting truth sets you free. And all of that is real. All of that was necessary. But there's a ceiling to what confrontation and understanding can accomplish, and you've hit it. You've hit it not because you failed, but because you succeeded at everything effort could achieve. Now you're standing at the edge of a territory where your usual tools are useless, and the only way forward is to put them down. Think about someone who spent years in therapy processing childhood trauma. They understand exactly what happened to them. They can articulate how it shaped their attachment patterns, their relationship choices, their self-concept. They've grieved what was lost. They've raged at what was taken. They've done forgiveness work, or they've consciously chosen not to forgive and made peace with that choice. Every angle has been explored. Every layer has been processed. And still they wake up some mornings with a heaviness that has no name and no origin they can trace. Not depression exactly, not unresolved grief. Something more fundamental, something that exists beneath the level where therapy operates. Jung discovered that this heaviness was actually the weight of the ego, trying to hold together a transformation it couldn't control. The psyche was trying to reorganize at a level deeper than the ego could manage, but the ego kept intervening, kept analyzing, kept trying to process what was happening, kept applying the tools that had worked so well at earlier stages, and every intervention, no matter how sophisticated, was like trying to help a butterfly emerge from its cocoon by pulling the cocoon open. The help was the harm. The effort was preventing the very emergence it was trying to facilitate. The Sophia stage begins the moment you recognize this. Not intellectually, because you've probably understood the concept of surrender for years. Intellectually grasping surrender is just the ego adding another concept to its collection. The Sophia stage begins when something in your body, your nervous system, your lived experience actually stops reaching. When the hands that were always grasping for the next insight, the next healing, the next breakthrough, simply open. Not because you decided to open them, because they're too tired to stay closed. Something in you already knows the difference between a tool that gives the ego more to do and one that helps it loosen its grip. The True Self-Discovery Guide was written with that difference in mind. 24 reflections rooted in Jung's work, less about digging deeper and more about noticing what all that digging already uncovered. It's in the description. Now, let me show you what Jung observed in patients who actually cross this threshold, because it changes what surrender looks like entirely. Jung described the Sophia archetype as the personification of wisdom that cannot be pursued, only received. In ancient traditions, Sophia wasn't a goddess you sought through pilgrimage or prayer. She was the wisdom that found you when you stopped seeking. She represented the intelligence of the psyche itself, the deeper ordering principle that knows how to heal what the conscious mind cannot. And Jung observed that this intelligence activated only when the ego stopped trying to run the show. This is why the Sophia stage feels like giving up. From the ego's perspective, surrender looks identical to defeat. The ego has only one framework for interpreting the cessation of effort: failure. So, when you reach the point where there's nothing left to do, the ego panics. It tells you you're regressing, that you're being passive, that you're wasting all the progress you've made. It floods you with anxiety about what will happen if you stop trying, because the ego's entire existence depends on being needed, on having problems to solve, on maintaining the illusion that consciousness is something you produce through effort, rather than something you receive through openness. Jung found that patients in the Sophia stage often went through a period that looked alarming from the outside. They'd lose interest in self-improvement, stop reading psychology books, cancel therapy appointments. Not because they were avoiding the work, but because they'd completed the work that was theirs to do and could feel that continuing to push was preventing something from arriving. Friends and family would worry. Are you okay? Are you depressed? Why aren't you working on yourself anymore? And the person in the Sophia stage couldn't explain what was happening because language belongs to the ego, and the ego didn't have words for this. What was actually happening, Jung documented, was a reorganization of the psyche at a level below conscious awareness. The self was integrating everything the ego had surfaced during years of shadow work, therapy, and self-confrontation. All those insights, all those grieved losses, all those confronted wounds were being woven into a new psychological structure. But this weaving couldn't happen while the ego was still pulling at the threads. The ego had to step back, had to allow the deeper intelligence to do work that the ego couldn't even perceive, let alone direct. Jung compared it to the way a broken bone heals. You can set it properly, you can protect it, you can provide the conditions for healing, but the actual knitting of bone is a biological process that happens on its own timetable and cannot be accelerated by willpower. Trying to use the broken limb before it's healed doesn't speed recovery, it prevents it. And the Sophia stage is the psychological equivalent of keeping the cast on and waiting, even when every part of you wants to test whether you're healed yet. The most difficult aspect of this stage is that it asks you to trust something you cannot see, measure, or verify. You've spent years developing discernment, learning to question, building the capacity to analyze and understand. Now you're being asked to exist in a space where analysis doesn't help and understanding isn't available. You're being asked to sit with not knowing, not as a temporary discomfort you endure until the next insight arrives, but as a sustained state of being that might last months or even longer. And during that time, you won't be able to tell whether you're transforming or deteriorating, because both feel exactly the same from the inside. Jung acknowledged that this was the hardest thing he ever asked patients to do, harder than shadow confrontation, harder than facing trauma, harder than dismantling false identities, because all of those tasks, painful as they were, still gave the ego something to do. They still allowed the person to feel like an active participant in their own healing. The Sophia stage removes that entirely. You become a witness to your own transformation rather than its architect. And for people who built their identity on being strong enough to do the work, becoming someone who waits is a kind of death. But it's precisely this death that the Sophia stage requires. Not the death of the self, but the death of the self as doer. The death of the identity that says, I heal myself through my own effort. The death of the spiritual achiever, the psychological warrior, the person who overcomes. All of those identities served you. All of them were necessary at earlier stages. But they've become the final barrier between you and the wholeness that's trying to emerge. Because wholeness isn't something you build, it's something you allow. And you can't allow it while you're still building. Jung observed a specific shift in patients who successfully navigated this stage. There was a moment, impossible to predict, impossible to force, when the waiting transformed from endurance into peace, when the not knowing stopped being frightening and became spacious, when the absence of effort stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like freedom. He described patients breaking into tears, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of no longer having to hold everything together, of finally discovering that something had been holding them all along, something they couldn't feel while they were gripping so tightly. This is the Sophia wisdom, the recognition that you were never the one doing the real healing, that your effort, necessary as it was always just clearing the path for a deeper intelligence to do what it already knew how to do, that the ego's job was to prepare the ground and then get out of the way. And that getting out of the way is the one thing the ego will resist until it literally cannot resist anymore. What emerges on the other side of the Sophia stage isn't what most people expect. It's not bliss or enlightenment or the feeling of having arrived somewhere final. It's something much quieter and much more profound. Jung described it as a relationship with the self that no longer needs the ego to mediate, a trust in your own depths that doesn't require understanding, a capacity to move through life without needing to analyze every experience, process every emotion, or understand every pattern before you can be at peace with it. People who've passed through the Sophia stage carry a kind of calm that isn't performed. It doesn't come from techniques or practices. It comes from having touched the bottom of their own psyche and discovered that the bottom held, that underneath all the wounds, all the shadow, all the defense mechanisms and trauma responses and carefully constructed identities, there was something intact, something that had never been damaged despite everything that happened. And knowing this, not as a concept but as lived experience, changes how you inhabit your own life in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to lose. Jung was careful to distinguish this from spiritual bypassing. The Sophia stage isn't about skipping the hard work and jumping to acceptance. It's only accessible to people who have already done the hard work thoroughly. You can't surrender what you haven't first claimed. You can't let go of control you never actually developed. The Sophia stage requires a fully developed ego, a well-integrated shadow, a deeply honest relationship with your own psychology. Only then is there something substantial enough to surrender. Only then does letting go mean anything beyond avoidance dressed in spiritual language. This is why Jung placed Sophia at the end of the individuation process, not the beginning. It's the stage that follows everything else. The stage that becomes available only when you've genuinely exhausted what effort can accomplish. If you're still in the thick of shadow work, still confronting wounds, still building boundaries and developing self-awareness, then the Sophia stage isn't where you are, and trying to skip ahead to surrender will only delay the work that's currently yours to do. Surrender without prior integration isn't wisdom, it's collapse. But if you've done the work, if you've faced what needed facing, grieved what needed grieving, built what needed building, confronted what needed confronting, and if you've arrived at a place where you've run out of things to do and something still hasn't resolved, then this is where you are. This is the Sophia stage, and the only instruction that applies here is the one your ego will resist most fiercely. Stop trying. Not because trying was wrong, because trying has completed its purpose. What comes next requires a different kind of participation, the kind where you show up fully present but without an agenda, where you remain conscious but stop directing, where you stay awake while letting the dream dream itself through you. Jung spent the last years of his career studying patients who reached this stage, and what struck him most was how rarely they could be helped by traditional methods. No technique facilitated the Sophia transition. No intervention accelerated it. The therapist's role, Jung concluded, was simply to be present, to witness, to confirm that what the patient was experiencing wasn't regression or avoidance, but the most advanced stage of psychological development a human being can undergo. Sometimes that confirmation, that single act of someone else recognizing what was happening, was enough to allow the person to stop fighting the surrender and let it carry them. If you're reading this and something in your chest is softening, something that's been clenched for years, then you already know what I'm describing. You've been at this threshold, maybe for a long time. You've been standing at the edge where your tools stop working and something wordless begins. And you've been terrified because the ego translates this threshold as danger. But Jung would tell you that this threshold is the most important one you'll ever cross. Not the shadow confrontation, not the boundary setting, not the trauma processing. This one, this moment where you discover that the deepest transformation of your life requires you to do the thing that feels most impossible. Trust what you can't control, allow what you can't direct, receive what you can't earn. The Sophia stage isn't comfortable, it isn't quick, and it doesn't come with any guarantees except one. What you are underneath everything you've been trying to fix is already whole, already sufficient, already present. You've just been too busy trying to create it to notice it was already there. And when you finally stop creating long enough to notice, when the hands unclench and the mind quiets and the effort that defined you falls away like a coat you've been wearing so long, you forgot it wasn't your skin. What remains is the wisdom that was waiting all along, not earned, not achieved, received, because you finally became still enough to let it in. That's the Sophia stage. That's what Jung found at the end of the individuation road. Not another task, not another confrontation. A homecoming so quiet, you might miss it if you're still making noise, but you won't miss it. Because by the time you arrive here, you'll be tired enough to finally listen to the silence. And the silence will have everything you need. 24 reflections, not tasks, not homework. Just ways of being still enough to notice what's been waiting underneath. The True Self-Discovery Guide is in the description. For whenever the trying finally softens into listening,